ready, with Ulrik Franke from the Research Institute of Sweden, presenting his paper, A Survey on Cybersecurity in the Swedish Manufacturing Industry. So all yours.
Thank you very much. So I am happy to give this presentation here, and I believe that it will also be a nice continuation of the previous talk. So I should first mention that it is joint work together with Joakim Wernberg from the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum, and we investigated, as Arnav said, the cybersecurity of the Swedish manufacturing industry. Now, let's see here. I'm trying to move to the next slide, but it seems that, thank you. So, briefly stated then, why is this interesting? Well, manufacturing is not what it used to be. So it is an area which is being transformed, basically. We have new advances like additive manufacturing, we have Internet of Things, we have virtual and augmented reality, and so on. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the term smart industry or industry 4.0. Now, this means that we, in this increasingly digitalized and interconnected production, there are new types of unintentional incidents and also new kinds of adversarial attacks. And again, I'm trying to, okay, it seems I can't really advance the screen for some reason. Thank you. Right, and we can move ahead once more. So the bottom line here is basically that to reap the benefits of digital transformation in manufacturing, we need to have corresponding cyber security measures. And this is what we have been trying to measure in this small study. So we again try to move ahead. We'll mention the research questions. There are 3 of them. Firstly, what is the collective risk cyber risk perception in the Swedish manufacturing industry? So basically, what does the industry think about cyber risks? And now, of course, this is interesting in its own right, but it becomes more interesting when coupled with the second research question, which is how firms value the need for cybersecurity compared to the anticipated impact of digitalization in their organizations. So, of course, if you don't anticipate to be very digital, then you don't need to spend as much resources to counter the cyber risks. Whereas if you invest heavily in becoming the smart industry, well, then you need to ramp up your cybersecurity efforts. And the third research question, of course, complementing the 2 previous ones, what kind of measures are in place? How do firms try to manage their cybersecurity? So empirical investigation of the risk controls that are in place. Right, so let's move on then to the method. What did we do? Well, we did a survey and we benefited very much from the collaboration with the Association of Swedish Engineering Industries, which allowed us to send out our questionnaire to their members. So if we move ahead, we basically developed the questionnaire first, the authors, and also in collaboration with the Novus, which is a polling firm which we used here. And we did this last fall. And then the survey went live in November last year. It was sent out to almost 4,000 respondents. We received 649 responses. So that is a 17% response rate, which is, well, not great. But luckily, pretty representative of the overall population, which still makes us feel pretty confident then in our interpretation of the results. So, and that is where we now turn to the results. So, first question basically concerning the overall cybersecurity awareness as perceived then by the respondents, but answering sort of what is their perception of the entire industry. And perhaps not very exciting answers. It seems like a normal distribution. It's not that respondents typically believe that everyone is fully aware, but they typically select the middle ground. And of course, as we move on to the coming results, we will have reason to interpret this, of course, in light of what we can see and what we can learn from how they actually treat their cybersecurity. But moving on then to threat perception and reporting incidents. So a lot of figures, a lot of bars here, but what's interesting to note here basically is that the risk awareness or well, basically the respondents here, they were not very worried. If you look to those who perceive a very high risk or even a high risk, it's by far the minority compared to those perceiving moderate risks or low risks or even very low risks. So basically we have, I mean, in the vicinity of some 15–20%, depending on the kind of threat we are considering here, who find themselves to be at the high risk or very high risk. And of course, you can discuss what is the ground truth here. We don't know that. As security researchers, we are, I guess, prone to believe that they underestimate the risks here, and I mean that's what I believe as well. But I also have to acknowledge that it's difficult to know for a fact here, even though we will get some hints in the coming slides that, at least in my mind, suggest that they do underestimate the risk. In particular, when you consider how they look towards the future and the smart industry future, where they do intend to make use of the technological, the novel technologies that are poised to transform this line of industry. It's also interesting, if we move on to the next slide here, to look at the past year. What is their experience? Do they know of any breaches or any attacks? And this is, in a sense, consistent then with the previous slide. That I mean, 80% do not believe that they have had attacks or data breaches of any sort in the past year. And again, we might believe that this is, I mean, here I think that there is really pretty solid evidence to believe that this is underreported, because, of course, a skilled attacker would not be discovered. And we know that there is a typical time lag in the order of many months, perhaps, after an attack until it's actually being discovered. So I think it's pretty safe to say that this is, well, these figures are underreporting. But again, from a survey, we can't really know. But of course, it is consistent in a sense with the previous slide. They have not experienced these problems, attacks or breaches, in the past year, and hence they believe that the risk of doing so in the future will remain low. Still, of course, things are not static. They are undergoing this digital transformation, so they're looking at a moving target here in a sense. So if we again move on to look at this aspect of threat perception and reported incidents from a slightly different perspective, here we ask them what consequences would hit the company hardest. And business interruption by far is assessed as, in this respect, the most dangerous threat. And this, of course, makes sense from the perspective of this is manufacturing. So they are dealing with a physical process. They are moving things around. They are welding, and they are assembling things, and they are managing physical supply chains also with trains and trucks and things moving both the final products and the components needed and so on. So interruptions here are more difficult to handle than sort of purely digital interruptions like payment systems and so on. So this is also consistent with previous research that these kinds of enterprises typically do value business continuity very highly, and well, correspondingly then perceive business interruption to be a great threat. So various forms of data breaches, whether espionage or public leaks, are then much lower. It's also interesting to note that it's 9% who don't know which kind of incidents would hit them hardest. That's interesting to reflect on as well. And then perhaps these are the best respondents who are actually modest enough to realize that they cannot fully control or predict the consequences. But of course, possibly they are only, haven't done their homework well enough to understand their business and its dependency on technology. Right, but let's move ahead again to the issue of security in a sense versus general digitalization. So to make sense of this graph, then we have two sets of questions here, which are here imposed upon each other. So the first question, the slightly lighter bars here, is for which company operations will digitalization have the greatest impact? So basically, where will IoT and AI and robotics and so on actually matter the most? So where will the smart industry matter the most? And perhaps somewhat surprisingly, then given the buzzwords of additive manufacturing and so on, administration comes out on top. The darker bars concern security. So here we have the corresponding question for which company operations does cybersecurity play a particularly important role. So the interesting thing about this is that the rank ordering here is the same. So administration is where they believe that digitalization will have the greatest impact, and administration is also where they believe that cybersecurity plays the most important role. But there is a gap. So in this case, between 53 and 48% of respondents. And this gap is consistent across all these categories. So for each and every one of them, is the case that the impact of digitalization is assessed to be greater than the corresponding role for security. And in our interpretation, this hints to something important here, which can be sort of construed or viewed through the lens of the risk that you underestimate the need for cybersecurity. Namely that even though, to spell it out, even though they are thrilled to change their administration, or even more perhaps their product development, the corresponding need for security isn't really up there. Which of course, I mean, this relates to the questions of attack surfaces and so on. The attack surface will grow, of course, if administration or product development or marketing or sales or whatever becomes more digital. And then you need to grow your defense as well. And this hints that perhaps these respondents will not do that. And that brings us, of course, to what might be the single most interesting slide of this presentation, namely the mitigating mechanisms. What measures have the companies, if we move on here, what measures have these companies implemented in order to counter cybersecurity threats. Right. And what we see here, I believe, is quite interesting. So not all that surprising, perhaps, but interesting nonetheless. So, I mean, technical solutions then are top of the line here. And what does this mean? Well, this means that they have automated backups, they have automated access control, they have automated updates, and so on. Sort of the basic things that you can automate. They're in place, of course, only in 75% of respondents. So the rest really have homework to do. But basically, the respondents have grasped this. But then we see this corresponding decrease as we move down the ladder here. So having rules and processes in place to manage security. And now we're talking about rules for everything from bringing your own device to passwords to policies for cloud storage, the use of personal accounts and things, services on company computers and so on. This is only 66% of respondents who report that they do have. And strategies for cybersecurity, now we're down to less than half. Same thing for annual reviews of such strategies or annual reviews of continuity plans. And then at 30% comes cyber insurance. And this is actually interesting because I think that this figure would have been much lower if we had asked just a year or two ago. But what's interesting to mention here, in particular in this particular venue where we are interested in cyber insurance, is that the Swedish cyber insurance market in this respect has changed a lot basically during the last year. But what happened was that one of our bigger insurers, in particular, they have a big market share among this particular kind of companies, that is sort of SMEs in a sense. They decided to include a cyber insurance policy within their standard corporate package. So they rolled this out onto all their insureds and who had to actively decline not to get it. So during 2019, they basically rolled out in the order of 100,000 cyber insurance policies, meaning that a much bigger proportion of Swedish companies do have cyber insurance these days compared to a few years ago. So from that perspective, this relatively high figure makes sense. It would not have been that high a few years ago. And then, of course, it's also very well notable to see that fully 25% of respondents don't know. They haven't read their policies closely enough to be able to answer for certain whether they do have cyber insurance or not. And moving along down the ladder, we can go back just to finish off here. Training staff undertaken during the past year, clear minority, 22%. Same thing with conducting exercises on how to manage incidents, only 14%. And various forms of certification down to 11%. So, to take the bird's eye view here, I would say that in some sense, the simplest things have been implemented, and the more difficult in some sense, or the less technical and thus more taxing on organizational management, human resources, and so on, the less frequent are these mitigating mechanisms. Right. Now we can move on to conclude the discussion of mitigating mechanisms. So we also found it interesting to ask this question of to what extent employees bypass cybersecurity protocols. Perhaps as you would expect, only 19% of respondents say that this never happens, and they are well, they probably underestimate the problem, some of them at least. But then we have, well, seldom is the most frequent answer, sometimes and even often 3% that it happens, suggesting, of course, that they might do well to revise their policies. Even though it should be acknowledged here that this is a problem that will never go away, regardless of what kind of policy you have. Well, possibly with the exception of having no policy, then of course you will never have any breaches. That's not the situation you want to be in anyway. Right. So moving on here to discuss and wrap up. First, as I alluded to a few minutes ago, I think that this is an interesting area for more research, how to balance the growth of the attack surface with more digitalization, with corresponding growth in countermeasures. I really think that this is interesting. And the gap I was alluding to before is one of the rationales for this. The second point here in the discussion is about the distinction between accidents and attacks. So, well, one thing is known from previous work that practitioners don't always care about this difference. If you're just in the business of getting your systems up and running again, then it doesn't really matter who brought them down. But of course, this could be really important even to inform your strategy, because if it's a natural disaster, it will not second guess you and try to outsmart you, whereas an adversary might. So I think this is also an interesting area for future research. Would countermeasures be different if practitioners made this distinction, took care to uphold it? Also related questions here are, I mean, which countermeasures do the practitioners map to which one here? Do they expect the same to counter both accidents and attacks, or are they sort of consciously strategizing here with which is which? So those are interesting things for future research. However, let's move on to conclusions. So the first and perhaps most obvious conclusion here is that firms are not very worried. So as we've seen in the previous slides, very few rate the risks, the risks of cyber attacks or incidents as high or very high, and the vast majority think that they are not at risk. And similarly, the vast majority believe at least that they have not incurred an incident in the past year. And business interruption is a bigger worry than data breach. So secondly, highlighting again the gap between the estimated impact of digitalization on the one hand and the estimated need for cybersecurity on the other hand. So at least to me, then this suggests that cyber risks may be underestimated. And thirdly, the last conclusion, cyber risk controls in our assessment are in their infancy within the Swedish manufacturing industry. So less than half of respondents have cybersecurity strategies or continuity plans. In the past year, less than a fourth have trained their employees, and only about a seventh have conducted any exercises. And there is also this imbalance that I was hinting to before between technical measures, which are at least reasonably well implemented, and more social and organizationally oriented measures, which are implemented to a much lesser degree. So that concludes the presentation, and I open the floor for questions and reflections.
Thank you, Ulrik. It was a great presentation. We have 3 questions for you. So there's a question about the mitigating mechanisms slide. And one of the panelists is asking if there's some overlap in some of those areas.
Sorry, could you please repeat this question again?
Yeah, so one of the panelists is, in some of the areas that for the mitigating mechanisms.
If there are overlaps between these, yeah, of course. You might argue that our taxonomy here is not perfect. And this, of course, yeah, when we designed this questionnaire, we sort of had to balance between, on the one hand, trying to be rigorous as best we could, on the other hand, trying to word ourselves in such a way that practitioners would understand the question. And I didn't mention this, but I mentioned briefly that the respondents here were mostly SMEs, and typically the questionnaire was answered by the CEO, not an expert on cybersecurity. So this might have contributed to having categories here which are not necessarily mutually exclusive.
Yeah, we have a second question, which is, are these cyber insurance policies were rolled out standalone policies or integrated policies? Right.
So these are integrated within the total offering made by the Land Society and the insurer. So that was how they were able to roll them out. So they basically took their standard corporate insurance and they put some cyber clauses into it, and then roll it out onto their existing customer base. And that's how they were able to expand so rapidly.
So we had a panelist from Norway yesterday that he was comparing the adoption of security response teams in the oil sector and the power grid sector. And they found a lot of difference in maturity. So apparently in the oil sector, they are still quite in the startup state, while in the power sector, probably because they are more government owned, they have more maturity. Do you know, or have you observed if there's more maturity in different sectors than not the engineering one or the manufacturing one?
That's a good question. I wish I had a better answer to it. So this particular survey that I've been describing here addresses only one sector, the sort of manufacturing sector. So based on these results, it would be difficult to say. So looking at sort of my wider experience and other publications, I would say that the financial industry, in my experience, is often pretty mature. And sort of, even though I have not compared them explicitly, I have published studies both from financial industry and from this on manufacturing, and based on that, I would say that the financial industry is way ahead of manufacturing, at least in Sweden.
Yeah. So there are no more questions right now, but if you stay online and some other questions pop in, you can answer them through the chat. So thank you very much again, Ulrik. It's been a great presentation.
Thank you.
And I think that we can move to the last but not least